say definitively that religions are all bullshit.
Welcome to Brainstorm.
We have the explicit tag for a reason.
This is a base level argument to a higher level morality.
I get paid to science?
To science as much as one can science.
What the hell was my point?
Trigger warning. The Brainstorm podcast will criticize your most cherished beliefs. We attack nonsense in all its forms and discuss difficult subjects. If you peddle pseudoscience, supernatural woo, or religious dogma, then this is not your safe place. This is the home of hardcore skepticism.
Hi, and welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio, where we do interviews, major topics, and news related to skepticism and atheism. I'm Cory, and today I've got a bit of a different episode for you. Normally on the second week of our rotation, we do the Shift to Reason radio, but this time around I've got another interview/discussion, so instead it's in the Skeptic Studio. For this interview, I talked to a YouTuber Anti-Feminist who goes by the name of Morally Grey. Obviously, I disagree with him about a few things, and we kind of get into some of that. I think I learned a little bit about the anti-feminist perspective that I didn't already know, and I'm happy to say that this conversation was not nearly as negative as I thought it would be. Gray uploaded his copy of our chat to his YouTube channel a couple days before this will go to release, so I got a chance to share it with some groups I'm in and get some constructive criticism and feedback, so I'll try to talk about that afterwards. So that's everything leading into the interview. Here's my chat with Gray. Why don't you, I guess, let people know who you are and kind of give what you do, where can people find you kind of stuff?
Sure. Okay. Well, my name is Gray. I run a YouTube channel called Morally Grey. I think it's a cute little name. Haha. Over on YouTube, I just hit 10,000 subscribers last month, and I'm still kind of growing up there. So yeah, I tend to do content related around the sort of culture wars that's the social justice, feminism sort of stuff that's been taking place and raging since about 2012. It really sort of picked up. Yeah, that's my sort of general thing that I do.
Okay. So I guess you, in our interactions, you kind of identified yourself as an anti-SJW. I wonder if you can maybe expand on that. What is an anti-SJW?
Well, in my case, I sort of fall in this sort of anti-feminist, anti-social justice sort of bracket, simply because to me it's a fundamental principle of equality to me, right? So I don't view the feminist and social justice groups as necessarily being a vessel for equality. I find that there are a lot of shortcomings, a lot of various different blights that they tend to promote upon society. As a result, I feel like I kind of have to sort of fight back against that. So for me, it's sort of like a principle of equality, and I find that a lot of people within the anti-social justice side sort of reciprocate this feeling, because there's this very strong feeling of these people are encroaching upon things, they're breaking things, let's fight back against it. So that's my general sort of thing. Do I really define it? Well, not really. I kind of view it like my atheism, like it's a thing, but it's not like a life-deciding sort of thing. You know, it's just a political thing.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. From my perspective, I see feminism and much of the social justice activism that goes on in the world as promoting equality. I wonder, we appear to have a disconnect between our views on it. I wonder where that comes from. Do you have kind of a philosophy or an idea of what the philosophy that feeds your anti-feminist views? Like, I guess
that's interesting.
What I'm trying to get at is, why is there that disconnect between what I see and what you see?
Well, maybe it's because we probably focus on different elements of what people tend to do. Like, I mean, I look at a lot of different feminist resources and social justice resources, and what I tend to find is that this overly emphasized focus on one side of the spectrum and this sort of denial or rejection of the other side. And as a result, I look at that and I go, no, that's one-sided. That's not equality to me. Therefore, I move on. I think like hash out individual positions. I don't know if we would necessarily disagree on a lot of things for like individual issues. I think that for me, it is simply a question of how do we apply these particular things and how do we achieve these equality values. And unfortunately, when I see certain things like levels of quota systems and a number of other stuff, I tend to go, I'm not too comfortable with that. Or people wildly misrepresenting various statistics to push a political lean. I have a problem with that. My sort of core philosophy for who I am, I tend to focus on an idea of being true things as possible and removing as many false things as possible. And when I see like this, in order to promote their agendas which don't necessarily equal equality or ignore fundamental realities of things,
I guess I see what you're saying. Like, I want to believe as many true things as possible as well, and reject as many false things. But I wonder what kind of, say, if you were to give just an example of a statistic that you think has been misrepresented, what would you give as an example of that?
Okay, let's go down the really stereotyped path because everyone will see this coming eventually.
Right.
You have, let's pick the wage gap, probably the single most complex, simplified position possible. The thing is that this is a narrative that is strongly pervasive within social justice and feminist positions, right? The idea that women are paid less for exactly the same job across the board, and it is justified using an average statistic which takes into account virtually nothing of those variables. And when we take into account those variables, the gap shrinks quite rapidly.
Right.
The research we have on this, the answer to the wage immediately sexism, because one, sexism is of course subjective. What is sexist to one might not be subjective to other, and general consensus is we have this residual thing when we take account for everything. Know what that thing is, and it kind of comes down to a sort of a sexism of the gaps. You know, we can't explain this final little thing, therefore it's sexism, etc., etc. Some people path. There's a lot of education curriculum within Australia, in my own country. They will, in fact, teach that women are paid directly less for using average statistics that their position.
Okay.
So as a stereotype position, the wage gap would be a good one. Complicated issue. It's not as simple as men paid this, women paid this, therefore sexism. It is way that. And a lot of social justice academics go down that path, but there still seems to be this absolute draw that it is ultimately answered by sexism as opposed to a simple, well, we don't really know, and sexism probably isn't the best answer, if you get my drift from that. So that would be the best stereotyped sort of answer.
Right. Yeah. No, there is a lot of, even within social justice movements, there's a lot of discussion about where one can insert sexism or systemic sexism as an explanation of wage gaps or even some of the differences in career paths that men and women take.
Absolutely.
But I find that, I mean, myself, I often come down on the side of like, I come down on the side of there's a variety of reasons why women go into perhaps lower paying careers and that itself may have something to do with the way we're socialized. And as a result, not everything is 100% equal, right? Like, I mean, it's obviously a very complicated subject. And I think that it is worth, I think it's worth exploring many avenues to explain it and understand it. I just
do you think it's possible to have an environment where men are earning more than women on average? Do you think it's possible to have that?
Oh, it's possible to have an environment where men are earning more than women on average?
Yeah, do you think that's possible? And do you think that's possible and in fact justified? Do you think that's a possible scenario?
Well, I mean, it's certainly possible to have an environment where men are earning an average income of higher than women. I don't think that there's a good way to justify it. Does that make sense?
But let me throw a bit of a curveball. In Australia, this is one of the gripes I have with some of the Australian stuff. We know that demonstrably men work more in the workforce than women do. And I'm not talking like there's a higher quantity. I'm talking per hours. Men actually put more workforce. And there's a whole host of reasons why this is the case. But if you had an environment where, say, a man working, say, 2 or 3 hours more than a woman each week, and therefore he was being paid more than that, would you look at that as I do and say, well, it's justified that the man would be paid more than what the woman would in that case?
Well, from what I would say is likely that why is that happening? Like, I would wonder, how is it that, like, where is that coming from? Is she going home to take care? Are women in general going home earlier to take care of children because of traditional gender roles? And that could play an impact in that. And I don't think that necessarily that justifies the state that of men making more than women, because it could be reversed easily, right? Like, men could be the ones going home to take care of children on average rather than women, and then the hours work or put in would be different, right?
The only place I know where that is reversed is Denmark. Well, the only place where that is reversed is Denmark, from what I know. If you had a situation where that was the case, where men were in fact going home to look after kids more than what women were, there's reasonable. I would look at that and go, yeah, that's entirely reasonable why men would be earning less in that case. And in fact, it's this sort of divide between hours. One of the things I find very interesting is nobody ever really talks about part-time wage gaps. And like in Australia, because again, I'm here in Australia, in our part-time wage gap, it fluctuates quite wildly between women having more power, more earnings than men, and men having and again, there's more women in the part-time workforce, women put more work into the part-time workforce, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So that's a big factor. And from like work is because from the research, they've actually looked at this across virtually everything, even feminist resources. The hours worked is like one of the biggest descriptors as to why there is a difference between men and women.
Okay.
Wouldn't go so like I don't go that far and say this in terms of like, are they going home to look after kids? Because I don't necessarily see that as sexist, which is where we get down to like the subjective nature of this.
That's where I think that much of the disagreement comes from, is that people who are involved in feminism are looking at something like that statistic and they go, well, why is that? And they find out that, so women are often the caregivers at home, so they have to leave work earlier. And yeah, it may not be like what one might label as sexist, but it is a result of gender roles that put women in this role and men in this role. and it is in a sense not equal, right? Because different things are expected from the women that results in, in them not being able to make as much money as the men. And I think that, you see where I'm coming from?
I do see where you're coming from. I know what you're saying. You're sort of going on about that women are sort of shuffled into these brackets and men are shuffled into these brackets. And is that equality? To me, do we pay attention? Like there are certain things in society such as this. Like this is a really interesting one because eventually biological causes as to why this will take place. Because like we know what's that bloody effect? There's a psychological phenomenon. I can't remember what it is, but the more and more freedom people get, they eventually end up putting themselves more and more into these roles. Hell, that's pretty cool, dude. There's a big thing in Finland for a while there where like they were really going down this radical social justice path, and they were giving people as much freedom as possible. And what they were finding is that people were really these bloody gender prescribed roles. Like I don't view gender roles as unequal in certain senses. Like, I mean, it depends on how you want to do it. Like if you say that a gender role that women can't work under, well, then I have a bit of a problem with that. But
yeah,
things in terms of, I
think there is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
But we're trying to talk over each other. My God. In terms of certain things, when we're talking about, there are degrees of severity to particular things. There are certain things that I'm comfortable with, and there's a lot of other people. And generally speaking, the ones that I'm comfortable with usually have a bit of a biological basis. Like I come from the perspective that men and women are in fact different, and I come from that perspective because I've got a lot of sort of academic lookings into evolutionary psychology and a number of others. Like my background is to look into various different psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but it's my studies. I went to uni for 5 years over this, but
cool.
Thing is that I come from the women are fundamentally different in this regard. I understand that there are certain different when they are sort of biologically basis. I don't really as like truths that need to be absolutely addressed before others sort of thing. So I add a weighting of preference. If like we have, because energies alone are a big one. For a man, it's possible to have absolutely no impact on your kids, but for a woman, it's literally impossible. So there'll be differences that come out from that. And if we have women that are desiring to be with kids or to be the homemaking in that environment and taken out of work because of pregnancy, which is a big thing that I don't think we'll ever solve. Like, I don't know how we're going to solve pregnancy as a sign, because it's a biological thing, and it will take women out of the workforce no matter what. And as a result, you'll have more men moving up through the workforce because women are out of the workforce. Like that imbalance to me, I don't think that can actually be solved. So I sort of write it off, if you get what I'm saying. And I think that when I say, okay, there are all these really bad things that take place, hashtag, quote unquote bad things, like women are with kids more, just a natural result of things. And is that really sexist? I'm like sexist in a bad way. I'm sure, like, if you get my drift on that, I'm not convinced on that yet.
No, I think I see where you're coming from. And the thing is, I think that maybe, I mean, obviously we can't make men get pregnant.
No.
But we can we can change the system so that men can take paternity leave, and get them more involved.
And in fact, we should.
Yeah, stuff like that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I see.
It's just such a shame that a lot of the feminist groups in Australia are kind of against that sort of stuff.
Oh, is that right? We're actually
in Australia, we have a mandatory 1 year for both genders. 1 year for both genders. But there was a push to have that increased for women, but not increased for men, which is really silly because realistically, like I would say that your approach to this would make sense, right? Like in Denmark and Sweden, one of the things they did is they said, well, more paternity leave, give men more reasons to leave the workforce, thus, and not doing it in a punitive sense. That's a good way of going about things. But unfortunately, over here, we have feminists that haven't really come to terms with that yet. And the punitive paths, they still go down the women first, women only sort of paths. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I can't speak to necessarily what feminist groups in Australia are doing, but from my own, what I've witnessed over here is that a lot of this stuff, like if a particular employer is, say, not supportive of men taking paternity leave, then that's where people will focus. And because we do have, I think, rules here as well where everybody gets a year of paternity leave. It might even be 18 months. I can't really remember entirely, but
you're in the States, aren't you?
I'm actually in Canada. The US, I don't know if they quite have the same rules. Yeah. Yeah. So I
was going to say, I'm not aware of the US stuff, but Canada, that sounds a little bit low for Canada because you've got Trudeau. He's a big feminist hero.
Well, yeah. There's a lot of discussion about whether how
discord over
that is. How performative is his progressivism, because the Liberal Party in Canada is a centrist party. So they often they'll campaign to the left a lot, but so that they can get that build up vote. And then they'll go and they'll govern a lot more right wing, a lot more fiscally conservative stuff like that. And I mean, that might be fine for some people, but for a lot of progressive leftist type people, that's a bit performative. We do have some good left wing parties here. It's just they can't get enough support because the Liberals appeal to center and center left. So just to give you a little bit on Canadian politics.
I consider myself to be a political centrist as well. Like, I don't consider myself to be someone who, like, I lean left. Don't get me wrong. I really do lean left. I'm more aligned with left parties than right parties. But generally speaking, the only reason why I consider myself, I'm willing to be like, oi, that's fucking stupid when it's like a left person versus a right person. Like, I have no filter that says that I'm perfectly allegiant to the left, that I won't question or that I won't cross the bridge if necessary. Like, I don't think that the right wing is permanently out of bad ideas. Sometimes they'll say something that probably makes some sense because they're usually very caution based. So if you're not really willing to move forward so quickly, the right wing's probably going to, voice up about that sort of stuff. Whereas the left is like, screw it, full steam ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a leftist, but it's not I don't identify as a leftist because it's the team I'm on, right? Like, I would, if the left suddenly became against equal rights or against, socialized medicine, or, if the left was suddenly not in line with my values, then I wouldn't be on the left anymore. But in fact, in Canada,
if that's the case, if that's the case, I know we're talking over, but I'm just interested. If that's the case, how do you reconcile with the rather anti-white elements of social justice? Like, I know this is going to be a really hot button topic next year. Like, 2018, man, is going to be the year of bitching out the alt-right, because most people are feminism and social justice at this point, and now the alt-right's moving into perspective, and everyone's like, right, how can we ridicule these motherfuckers? And trust me, they're going to get fucking destroyed. But generally speaking, how can you, if you're for equal treatment, how do you reconcile some of the real deliberately anti-white, very racist, very sexist in many cases elements of, say, feminism. Then,
well, because I don't.
Do you even know
actually,
what I'm talking about when I say that, though?
I don't even really like. I know that there are examples of things that people say, "Hey, that's racism against whites, and that's sexism against men." And from my perspective, I look at it and I go, "No, that's just trying to give people who have traditionally had a lower chance or a less chance an opportunity to be equal, right?" Like a buddy of mine, he, I guess, well, a former friend now, but he was always quite concerned with the idea that our cabinet was intentionally made 50% men and 50% women. He said, well, what if you're missing out on a better man for that job because you wanted to meet a quota for women? And I think
understandable.
And I asked that question to a couple of my interviews for the social justice series, and the answer often came back to me, and it was very satisfactory, that assumes that the men are in a more qualified position. Like, the women who got those jobs didn't get it because they're women. They got it because they're qualified. And of course, there's going to be a 50% ratio of men to women because they're just as qualified as men, and there's 50% of the population. So,
I mean, I see where that's coming from, but oh man, I don't know if I agree with that logic. But
it's again, like it is tough to sometimes get around the initial, hey, wait a second, this could impact me negatively. There's a university down in the US that was being sued because a girl felt that she should have got into this university. And she felt that it was anti-white racism that stopped her from getting in. And I mean, I don't know what the court has ultimately decided, but from what I could tell, I mean, she was, a moderately above average student. She was, she was fine, but she wasn't the best. And she got passed over for a person of color who was better than her. And instead it came out as like this. But was there a
quota system in place?
Well, they don't actually have quota systems. They're actually illegal in the US to have quotas.
So it's just a misunderstanding, basically.
Which is, I find, much of what's going on here. Like, a lot of the cases where people feel like white people have been oppressed or are being racist, prejudiced against, it's not a matter of actual policy that prejudices against them. It's that society is kind of moving towards this, hey, wait a second, that person of color is actually way more qualified than that white person. So let's not stop them because they're of another race. Did that make sense?
In the environments. Well, that does make sense in terms of the logic that's put forward. Like, I agree with the idea of, the sort of the microaggressions, the myth of meritocracy. Like, I agree with the idea that people should be valued upon their merits, realistically. Your gender, these things should not really come into the these arbitrary things of your existence. Don't pay attention to those. Let's just get the people who are really good for these positions and go forward. If you were to have a quota system that got 50% men and 50%, these are the women, the best of their best. These are the men, the best of their best. You're always going to have the argument of, what if the quota system wasn't in place? Would there be more men? Would there be more women, et cetera, et cetera? Find that the quota system inevitably just promotes a form of discourse that is unproductive. And if it is the case that we are playing field. We are going to know whether or not we are or we aren't if we don't have those systems in place. Like I don't even know if having those systems in place is productive in the long term. That proves that we've, solved anything, sort of thing. Aren't we really just putting a sort of a Band-Aid on something rather than actually solving it with those sort of things? Because if the issue is that people aren't naturally going into these fields, as it is in like so many different environments, when we're talking about women in particular, I don't know if we're addressing the core issue. And that by itself, when people recognize that, they go, well, now I feel like I'm completely cheated. Have a demonstrable advantage over me, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. The trouble is that, I find the trouble is that it's just often been the case that people of color in various countries or environments have been overlooked for certain positions, right? Or in schools and it has nothing to do with, like you say, their merits. It has more to do with biases and not even that people are overtly racist. It's just that they have these kind of almost internal views that they don't recognize, and they just don't call back the person with the racialized name or the woman's name or what have you.
Now you're sort of getting into like the implicit bias research that's out. Implicit bias is a really hit and miss thing, and social justice and feminism in particular, it seems to be something that's been like really embraced, and I that's for a good reason though. Like, implicit bias at its core is horrendously subjective. Like if we take here's a person with a African sounding name, here's a person with a Mexican sounding name, here's a person with a white sounding name, and they pick the white sounding name. From there could in fact be completely other reasons. It could have just been a flip of a coin for all it matters, right? Ascribing to them that what they're doing is because of some form of bias.
Yeah, individually, I think you have a point there, individually, but often with these, with the resume studies, it's identical resumes going out to, the same field type businesses. And the only thing they change is the name. It's so consistently, right? Like it's so consistently calling back only, or the majority white sounding names, or quote unquote white names, whatever that might be, names that can't be automatically racialized. And it's just so consistent that at some point you have to say, hey, like something's going on here, right?
Some of them are consistent. There are ones that definitely support the hypothesis that different names provide different results, of course. I've read these ones as well over the time. I read a couple of them a few years ago, but generally speaking, though, you've got a bit of a problem from, even if we acknowledge this, now we've got, how the hell are we going to address this? And realistically, you can actually measure for that, because again, you're right. Group-wise, you can put hit and miss wise. There are some there that people are going down these paths. Okay, fine. And in many research that shows that it's geographically based, which isn't surprising at all, realistically, when you think about it. There are different mentalities in different parts of the world. But when you go down this path, okay, so we want to solve this. So how can we solve this without getting down to an individual perspective? And when we're on an individual perspective, the chances for miss shots as opposed to actually hitting something are immense. Like, I don't know if you've ever looked at concepts that attempt to address this, such as the fabled microaggressions, which are pseudoscience to say the least. I don't know how much you've gone down those paths. I don't know how you solve those issues without creating more problems.
I don't know about. Yeah, sorry. I don't know about microaggressions per se, but with the they did a study where they tried to mitigate the gender bias in orchestras.
Sure.
I don't know if you heard of that. And what they basically
that's interesting. No, I haven't.
Yeah, there was apparently a gender bias, and orchestras were predominantly male, and it was incredibly difficult for women to get into them. But what they did was they made people take off their shoes when they were walking across the stage, and they had like a veil or a curtain where you couldn't even see the person's feet. And when they blinded these auditions this way, then the gender bias disappeared. So often with these kinds of things, like something like a resume study, I mean, it isn't necessarily conclusive in and of itself, but a way to mitigate it might be to install some kind of system where hiring is more blind, right?
For some environments, that probably would work. Like if we're talking again, if we stay on the musical industries, in those environments, it doesn't matter. It's how well you play while you do that. So in those environments, I can see how people would easily get away with doing it. But how can you tackle something like that in sales? Like, that's a very personal position. That's a very, you have to know who the person is. You have to see their demeanor. You have to see how they operate, et cetera, et cetera. Gets much more difficult, and I don't know if it's applicable to everything.
Yeah, no, that's probably a fair statement. Like,
actually.
Yeah, like, it's just, like I say, with the resume studies, often it was not so much that that they didn't meet the people. They just, once the resume, they just didn't get called back, right? Like, so once the callbacks happen. So, I mean, if they blinded the resume section, say, if there was some way to blind that, and then you get your callbacks, and then maybe we find a different way of mitigating a new bias that happens to pop up. Like, I mean, obviously social progress is a work in progress. It's ever evolving the more we learn. And I don't necessarily think that saying like, well, how do we mitigate that means we shouldn't try, right?
Because no, of course we should absolutely continue trying about that. I'm not an advocate that we just give up. Of course not. But, like, in Australia here, we will a lot of things on that. And again, question of how much can before it just becomes a complete waste of time sort of thing. Right. So like in Australia, you're not allowed to work, like the employer isn't meant for certain things. You can provide it on your resume, but generally speaking, they're not meant to ask for things like your gender, your age, your race, the various, unless it's specifically required for the job, like you need to, right, or you need an Asian woman to play a part, then you can. But we've tried to mitigate certain things like that, but on a society scale, it's feasible. It seems far too difficult, and it is definitely prone to causing more problems than good, as far as I can see. Maybe we should be focusing on other things, sort of stuff,
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I could see what you're saying, but I have trouble saying like, okay, so we've found that this group of people don't get hired at these types of businesses in general, and we're just, gonna leave it, like maybe we don't have to focus on it entirely as a society, but we should, I do still think we should constantly be examining these things. And I mean, I don't know. We should, I feel like
I know what you're saying though, because it's from a perspective of frustration. You're sitting there like, oh my God, there's a problem. I need to solve it. I need to solve it now. What can we do to solve it? And I'm sitting here saying, well, I don't know if we can, and even if we could, I think that the expenditure of energy is so absurd that it's probably better suited for other things.
But I mean, I'm a white dude, so it's tough for me to tell somebody
high five
who has been. It's hard for me to tell somebody who has traditionally been like having trouble getting into certain fields because of their race to say, hey, nah, it's just not worth the effort to me. I think we should be focused on something else.
See, that's the type of racist shit that I have a problem with. Like,
except that's not.
Come on,
racist.
man!
That is specifically anti-racist.
It is. It's no. It's absolutely racist. You're saying you have a perspective that is trumped by other people, and that you don't have the ability to speak on things because of your race. That's bullshit.
You and I have different perspectives based on geology, right? You and I have different perspectives based on geology. Yeah. So
absolutely.
What other factors
that
can a person just not?
You can't tell me about mine.
I can say, like, hey, I don't know where you're coming from based on like a lack of perspective from Australia. I don't know what it's like to live in Australia.
But if you had,
I also don't know what it's like to live as a black person.
I mean, it's dangerous.
But
that doesn't mean you can't inform me about something that is Australian that I'm not. Likewise, it's exactly the same across the board. If you're going, this is one of the things that really shits me to tears about a lot of the sort of ingrained racism of feminism. No, but it is racist because you're
totally saying
that certain things are off limits because of your racial bias. No, that's racial arbitrary. It's
not
arbitrary.
Off limits. It is important to recognize other people. Other people have different perspectives, right? And I don't have the perspective of a black person, right? Or a First Nations person in Canada. I don't have that perspective.
Okay, sure.
So when I want to learn about that perspective or speak to that perspective, it's important that I learn from people who know what that perspective is.
Okay, but that's
the point.
Kind of different than what you were saying. So what if the black
that's exactly what it is.
What if the black person in question says that you can't know something because you've never been black?
Is it related to being black? Is it something that only black people experience? If it's something that I don't experience because of being white, then how could I possibly know it?
Learn about these things. Like if it's off limits to you knowing completely and therefore being unable to educate others on these particular things, then with anything else. But the fact of the matter is that you can't be things off because of various different arbitrary factors of human existence. We can learn anything we bloody well want. Basically, we're running everything like software off the brain anyway. So.
Right, we can't actually experience it, and it's not. I mean, learning about it as though it's facts is one thing, but actually experiencing it is a different thing.
So, what are you saying?
And it informs,
so we can't.
Therefore, it informs somebody's life in a different way, and the way they react to things in a different way.
So
I grew up.
Okay, then in that case,
go ahead.
Okay,
no, go ahead.
Yep.
No,
I do want to. God damn, we are so timid.
Well, I guess even among my own compatriots on the social justice side, I'm considered the true neutral guy who wants to be as honest and factual as I can, and I want to give everybody a fair shake, and I want to hear everybody's perspective because I know my perspective, and even though you tell me what you think, feel, live through, I can't experience that. And I try to give everybody that chance to express themselves. So, I mean, that's true,
though. I don't know if it's true that you can be locked off from particular experiences. I really don't think that's the case.
Well,
because you can, because if we're talking about biases that people are informing upon others from purely social groups, all you have to do is somehow get yourself to be associated with that social group in the correct ways for you to begin experiencing that thing, whatever that is, right? So,
well,
I mean, if that means going out in perfect blackface like a Rachel Dolezal or Dolezal, then awesome, but. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that's locked off to people. And therefore, saying anything along those lines that it may, or implying that it may be locked off in any way, I mean, me, it just speaks of racism. I don't know, man. Yeah, I can't abide by it. Like, that's where I come to the point of, like,
just stand on the opposite side. Like, I cannot possibly know what it's like to be you. You know, like, it's just where I stand.
I disagree. I think you could. But because I fundamentally think that if I had the same experiences as you, or if you walked me through your life in a day-to-day, I could at the very least understand your perspective pretty damn well. And if I followed you, everything, like, I think I could get a pretty damn good understanding of your position and say that I've probably experienced a fair amount of it's been there. Maybe it's a third party, maybe, but the fact is, I don't think that's a completely Trump wall of hell. You know, I don't think we can't cross that barrier.
There is certainly something to what you're saying there, actually, because anthropologists love to do that, right? Like, they'll do that
Absolutely.
With people where they'll just stay with that person and learn as much as they can about them. We talked to a guy on Brainstorm who did that with a woman who had traveled back to her home in, oh, damn it, I can't remember what the country was, but where they do female circumcision, and she went through the performance on her, like, consensually.
Jesus.
So,
what? Okay.
And so he did this study of her, and it's fascinating, but that's the kind of thing that anthropologists love to do. But I think, I mean, you can learn what their life is like now, but it's still informed to some extent by your own experiences, right? Like, because,
well, yes, it is. But,
like you said, you're still observing it as a third. That doesn't mean that thing locked off to me. Sorry?
Well, true, in the immediate, but that doesn't mean that it's completely locked off to me, is what I'm saying. And unfortunately, like, you've got to admit, like, you say that you're a sort of a center of your group, right? That there are people within, I guess you could say, your sort of, without lack of better words, your side of the camp, that do go down the paths of, I am a black person, or I am a woman, or I am whatever. So therefore, if you are not anything that you say contradicting my position is breaking my lived experience, and you are wrong by definition. Shit, that is a reality that you have noticed within the feminist groups, even if, do you see that extremism aspect?
I think there's more to it than that. Like, I have seen people react in ways that I consider maybe over the top or what have you. But at the same time, often, like, if they're saying, well, you can't speak to my experience, it's often to a person who's actively not listening to them express their experience. So it's not that they're talking to an anthropologist who's lived with them day in and day out and saying, well, you have no idea what my life is like. They're talking to somebody who lives a completely opposite life to them in many ways, and actively refuses to listen to them express themselves. So
I mean, I see what you're saying. I have experienced. I've seen that take place as well, but I've also seen the inverse, where this sort of walling of ideology in this extent down communications between two different groups, though. It absolutely does. So person saying that, and therefore they are right, and the other person can't possibly understand, therefore, get in line sort of thing.
Well, there's something to that where it might not help communication. But at the same time, I feel like we have to kind of listen to what they're saying when they say stuff like that. Not just get defensive and angry that they're being anti-white, say, but that why do they feel that I can't understand their life? What is it that they've gone through that I haven't necessarily experienced? What's going on between us that is stopping communication? I think a lot of this, I mean, you might not like the way is a kind of a defensiveness or a fragility that every time we're told, hey, you don't get what I'm saying, we get defensive and we're like, no, I fucking get what you're saying. Like, how can you say that to me? Like it's
true.
When we're
true, there's a defensiveness, but it's also because people literally do believe that they understand.
Well,
could also be an accusation in return.
Yeah, like if somebody genuinely believes that they understand, then it seems to me that they're better off to maybe say to themselves, like, maybe I understand one thing, but not everything, or maybe there's, I get it. I do it a lot myself, this defensiveness that happens, but I just sometimes wonder, like, maybe if we just stop being defensive so often whenever we feel like there's an attack on men or an attack on white people, like maybe we just need to listen more.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster. Like, I do think people should be defensive. Like, in many respects, defensive it's a natural part of human discourse in many respects. And if you're educating people down the path of saying, look, don't be defensive, just listen, just accept, as is a very common theme within social justice and feminism, you're essentially promoting complacency. And that's not healthy towards discussing issues, because it is possible that someone could it's very possible. I've seen it happen many times where people will say something that's just demonstrably bullshit, and because it's their lived experience, quote unquote, you are penalized for even trying to question that. And in many respects, wow. I am one of those people that kind of sees the parallels between modern feminism and religions in many respects, because religions do that. It is pretty much based on social, personal experience.
There's quite a bit of a difference there, though, isn't there? Like, religion is this kind of. There's no way you can prove God or any of or multiple tenets of religion, but feminism is like, okay, so men and women exist, sexism exists. Society exists in such a way that men have traditionally, or many societies exist in a way that men have traditionally had the reins of power and have often kept those reins of power out of the hands of women. And like, these are things that actually exist. And it seems a far cry from religion to me to say that they don't.
Not particularly, because you're talking about, like, when you get down to the ideological aspect, which does encompass all of that, there is an element of a sort of a faith-based aspect to this. Like, for instance, in the closest representation of a deity figure that people have within feminism, you've got a god figure, but you have a patriarchy figure on the feminist side, and it's really funny because from my perspective, and frankly from anyone's perspective that is not, which is something I find very interesting, concept of the patriarchy. It is everything and yet nothing at the same time, and it is entirely dependent upon the eye of the beholder. And like this is something that you can see quite clearly in hang on, what's a good example? I haven't thought ahead of this, but I'm going on. I know.
That's all right. We're both just winging it, right?
You interviewed, and why I reached out to you, actually, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Christy Winters, right?
Yes.
Like, fuck me. Now that I think about it, God, we've been trying to set this talk up for ages. What has it been since like April? Anyway, God damn it.
Well, it's been definitely a couple months anyway. Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so happy we're doing this. But so Kristen Winters did a Proofs of Patriarchy series, right? When you take all those together and tally them up, and you look at it as a bigger picture as opposed to just looking as their individual aspects. If you look at the individual aspects, you go, oh yeah, okay, there's something there, there's something there, there's something there. That might be sexist, that might be sexist, cool. But if you take it all in one perspective, you go, my God, she's literally defining everything but yet nothing at the same time. Actually, she's not really defining anything. What the hell is going on here? And this, as far as I can see, explains a lot of these bad results where you even have infighting within feminism as to what is patriarchy and what is not patriarchy. So the closest thing to a deity figure is this notion of societal sexism, because it is, in many respects, quite subjective in how you propose it. There are certain things which are just blatant, obviously, but then there are little things which we hang on to today, such as like the wage gap and stuff like this, that, I mean, it's really hit and miss. And the amount of purchase people put into this stuff is well on the level of a religious figure. People just believe it and run with it and never question it under any circumstances. So, yeah, the closest thing would be this concept of the patriarchy.
So, do you accept or reject the concept of the patriarchy?
Well, at this present point, I do not believe it has met its burden of proof. So in terms of rejecting it outright and saying it's absolutely inaccurate, no, I don't do that. Because, again, you can find small individual things. The thing that I have a major issue with is how it is utilized. It is utilized in a way that, like I say, it is both everything and yet nothing at the same time, entirely based on the eye of the beholder. So what, it's the age-old thing of put 10 different people in a room, give them the same question, get them to answer back, and you'll get 10 different answers. And that is unfortunately the case with things like patriarchy. So,
okay.
It's subjective hyperbole that is mostly an ideology. So I don't agree with it on that principle. So, yeah, it's kind of my same positions with God. Like, I don't outright reject the God that it absolutely doesn't exist. Evidence for a God, but that's not the point. It is on a similar category.
Interesting. I mean, I disagree, but I find your
plus you've got all the moral messages. You've got all the moral messages of feminism as well, and religions are mostly, morally constrained. So there's that as well. People run their lives by feminism in many respects, whereas I don't run my life by atheism. You get the idea.
Well, I guess sort of. I mean, I do kind of run my life by atheism. Like I pay no mind to religious doctrine. I ignore the concept of God in my day-to-day life. So I very much do live by atheism.
Yeah, but do you do it intentionally? You're sitting there like you wake up in the morning, you get your cornflakes, you pour your milk in, you sit down, you go, there's no God. There's no God at all. Don't be dumb and keep it. No, is it really a thing like that?
There is a very real thing. Like if I'm watching a show that I enjoy and and all the characters suddenly decide that church is the thing they want to do, then I get annoyed. It is a thing that I find like religion permeates so much of day-to-day life that for so many people in society that, as from an atheist perspective, it does get frustrating that it's everywhere. I mean,
you and I will find lots of common ground here, believe me.
Right. So I mean, from a feminist who thinks of the patriarchy as religion, like from that perspective, like they might think that patriarchy is everywhere, and they see a thing where a woman is shut down in a conversation, like I can't remember what they call it, what the one term is.
Mansplaining.
Maybe that's it. but so they have a situation that they're seeing, and it frustrates them because it's so pervasive from their perspective that it can get irritating. I kind of think that, patriarchy as a religion maybe has some dynamics to it that, because religion exists.
Well, patriarchy as a religion, I don't know if I would phrase it that way. Like patriarchy as a deity figure would be more appropriate, because feminism as a religious entity, that would make a lot more sense, because you've got a lot of moral messages, you've got a lot of tenets, you've got a lot of how to live your life, etc., etc.
I think we just see it in opposite ways. That's interesting.
Have you noticed how the weapons you...
Sorry, you cut out?
Argumentative exactly the same way with feminism. Of the gaps, sexism of the gaps. Have you noticed this yet?
I don't think so.
You'll have people who will, if there's a religious group, they'll have people who will go, this particular thing I can't explain, therefore it's God. This particular thing I can't explain, therefore it's sexist.
I don't think I've seen that. I don't know, man.
Okay.
I feel like we're just having different experiences in many ways.
Perhaps that's probably true. I'd love to bring you over more into my experience. What do you think about, say, for instance, this, as far as I'm concerned, a well-earned baggage over time that feminism is anti-male, right? I do believe that in many respects feminism is anti-male. Now, it's different in Canada, but then again, you've got a lot of institutional power that's probably more. But over here, we have some particularly insidious things that are sort of taking place. Like, for instance, I'm doing a video on this soon, actually, where we have educational curriculums that, despite domestic violence in Australia being equal, where in many respects the lowest number I've seen it get down to is like 1 out of every 3 will be a male, so 2 will be affected by this problem. We still paint it as an exclusively gender-based issue where it's only women that are being affected by these problems, right? So
right.
How do you feel about people misrepresenting these particular things, or going rather insidious ways to get these positions across that are, rather biased in one way or another, sort of thing? How do you deal with that stuff? I don't know.
I mean, I guess it's tough to speak specifically to that. I think that there's there's actually a lot to unpack within something like that. I've actually got resources in front of me because it's part of the next video, et cetera. But I'll give you a quick thing, right? So there's this thing in Australia called the Respectful Relations education curriculum. And this has been widely criticized. It's only being put forth right now, mandated, that public schools have to do this in one state. So it's not absolutely there. But anyway, point is, they have this situation where you're given a boy and a girl scenario, right? And the scenario is that the girl is into having sex. She's 15, he's 16, a relationship, and she doesn't particularly feel comfortable having sex, etc., etc. She hasn't. Her mother is proud of her because of that. She sees her as a slut, which is her words, not mine. And she then gets really distraught over the ideas of seeing
seeing the boys on social media talking about all the scandalous things she could get up to with him on his birthday, right? The boy's perspective is that he's the strong, silent type. He doesn't really want to bother with sex because he hasn't found someone he truly loves. He's only 16. He's been with multiple people. His dad thinks he's awesome, et cetera, et cetera. It's this sort of, he's somewhat uncomfortable because his friends have all had sex, but he hasn't, therefore he can't share stories, and he sort of feels a little excluded, maybe. It doesn't really say he's excluded, but that's sort of the intention, is when you get into the questions that people ask this, and it's quite loaded in many respects in how it goes about. First and foremost, from the girl's perspective first. And the girl's perspective is, how does she feel about these? What does she go about? Do you think that the girl is, etc.? And they always phrase it in a way that it's very open. It's very sort of, there's ways to excuse this. But when you get the boy is what the issue is, there's no question what the issue is. And how do you think this? Blah, blah, blah. It goes down the list. There's more questions for the boys as well, mind you. The end, as opposed to the girl, which asks, do you think their relation between them is fine? It asks, do you think his relationship is fine, right? It's specifically weighted in a way that more punitive look on the boy's perspective than there is on the girl's perspective. Weighting that we see across the board of programs, a perspective to be negative towards men is really quite pervasive over here. And I'm wondering what you think about stuff, the idea that feminism does have this baggage of being anti-male. A good example, because it is very weighted in one direction over the other. How do you think about the baggage? Do you think that's an earned baggage on feminism?
I wouldn't blame feminism. I would, because that's a product of many of the ways society already views these roles, right?
Remember, this is ideological practices. These are born on, in many of the sort of stuff when kids say, I didn't realize the world was so sexist until I took these courses, right? These are encouraging people to believe that the world is super, super, super sexist and in a particular direction.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that sounds like a mischaracterization. I mean, of the situation, it seems like when somebody learns about certain things, like I didn't realize that religion was so pervasive until I learned about it, right? Like it was just, this is just the way the world is. And then I learned about a different perspective. And that's when I noticed some of these other things. So it's not that necessarily feminism is teaching women that men are sexist. It's that people are learning about the way, traditional, traditional gender roles are problematic because men are taught that this is the way they need to behave, and women are taught that this is the way they need to behave, and it just seems like almost a missing of what's intended. Does that make sense?
Because I look at this and I see where you're coming from. You think that if I'm to understand you correctly, you think that I'm coming from this perspective because I don't have a full set of information, and therefore I'm coming to a different conclusion. If that's correct on how you think.
Well, I think your conclusion. I don't know why one would come to the conclusion, but I do think your conclusion is missing what the actual intent was. Like, I think that it's not that, I mean, the world can be incredibly sexist in some ways. And that's that is something that is
Sure.
People are exposed to seeing that through learning about feminism and gender studies and whatnot. But I don't view it as anti-male. I view it as, these are the roles and these are the issues with those roles. And this is why we might want to learn about and try to subvert those roles in some ways. One of the things that I have a friend, he's on my,
That's
my
really
show,
interesting. Because
yeah, go ahead.
Yep. It's interesting. We're talking about the sort of baggage of feminism. Like, there's been this long-standing sort of what was it? The phrase was that feminism treats men like dysfunctional women, and that's I hear a lot of truth in that statement. You know, this idea that men as if broken women, as opposed to treating men like men. Like, do you think between men and women, or do you think it's the differences that we see in socially instructed? Like, are there natural difference in your opinion?
Well, I think there's both. Okay,
okay.
There are natural differences, obviously, but there are definitely differences that are just because society is structured the way it is, and we learn these roles growing up. Like, something that I particularly have taken a very an interest in is toxic masculinity.
Yes, I intend on doing a thing on that, actually.
I'd like to myself do quite a deep dive into it myself, because even before I knew what toxic masculinity was, I learned about this idea. Like, I noticed this tendency where men are taught that we have to be capable of violence, but never use it unless the situation is exactly right.
Even though we are naturally, generally speaking, on average, we are naturally. Unreasonable assumption, though, is it?
Yeah, like, well, yeah, it's hard. It's
for some men it might be. For like seriously effeminate men, you know, who really did not win the testosterone lottery, of course. For the average man, that is realistically
right. Well, but we're taught to be capable of violence, and it's reinforced in our daily lives.
But we are capable, though, aren't we? We do have. But
everybody's capable. We do, but that doesn't. I mean, that's
than what women generally do, don't we? Unless we're defending children. If we're defending children, then women win by a landslide. If you
But I just find it incredibly interesting that we're supposed to hone this tendency for violence, but we're supposed to have it, but let it out only in specific instances. And it seems to me that a lot of that's an issue where we shouldn't really be promoting men growing up and beating each other up as boys will be boys when that's damaging to people.
Because it's really funny, because I take a completely different look on that, because the boys being boys thing, like, because I do come from, you know, a very scientific based position that men and women are different, not just physically. We're like, well, technically everything is physical, but like cognitively we do, because like there's the age old phrase that anything cognitive is actually physical, because you're talking about the brain, etc., etc.
Yeah.
The differences in that regard. The boys will be boys. Like, I mean, that it is entirely socially constrained. I do think that there is a biological element to that, and in many respects, I think that the biological element actually informs the social element. So it came about because of this. Like, for instance, where you're sort of getting kind of hung up on the idea that we are capable of this natural, but we're instructed to only use it under certain circumstances, etc. etc. But I would say that the only use under certain circumstances is part and parcel because we are working together as a social group. And that's the natural thing of any, like, if you don't instruct people to do that, it's just anarchy. You know, like everyone's saying everyone's terrible, etc. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. As a problem, I
really think that we, rather than encouraging or passing over the people are capable of violence thing as because we're biologically capable of doing violence, that's something that we should maybe examine a little bit more. And maybe we should spend some time wondering why we allow ourselves to be like that way. And like it goes even further to ideas of emotion, because we're also trained to only have a limited range of emotions in some ways. Like I was never taught that it was okay to be sad growing up. You know, like anger is fine, but sadness isn't okay because that's weak. And that's this idea that this is the kind of teaching that we get. And I know plenty of men who didn't receive that teaching, but some of us did. And it's an issue. And it is more common in society, I think, than
yeah, it's funny because,
Go ahead.
You there? You cut out.
Yeah. No, I'm here. It's just, I mean, the idea of toxic masculinity, it explores a lot of these things.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a problem. Here's another really interesting thing because we're back, but here's a really interesting thing though. Again, sort of harping on the toxic masculinity thing, but looking at this from, again, going back to the baggage aspect of being anti-male, have you noticed how much of an unbridled deficit there is for a counter to that, a toxic femininity, as a sense? Have you realistically, because Christianity, there is a deliberately negative aspect to it, right? It is, even if it's not used in the same ways as it is in academia, in social life, the way toxic masculinity is used is mostly a bludgeoning club to beat people over the head with. You know, that's a toxically masculine thing. Don't do that, etc., etc. My question to you is, have you noticed, first and foremost, there is on a concept like toxic femininity, and do you think that again, the baggage that feminism might in fact be anti-male?
I think you're probably going to disagree with my answer.
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me? Oh. There's a bit of a break here where we reset the call because there was just too much of a delay. I think there's still a couple minutes of usable audio here just to close out the conversation a little bit. So I guess in a way, this is your warning that the episode is coming to an end right away. There's a little bit left, and then we had troubles again, so we had to just quit the call. So I guess we were talking about toxic masculinity. And you don't really, I'm interested in your perspective on it, because obviously I am on the board with toxic masculinity as a thing and it's damaging. And I mean, you obviously have a different perspective. I'm interested to hear it.
I see the way the feminist and social justice groups identify toxic masculinity, generally speaking, undesirable things that women see in men more than men see in men. And I find that when you have men to the side of things, it goes down that path. Now, it's honestly a problem within feminism that it is a very one-sided perspective into the equality things, etc., etc. Just in it. There are many things they're talking. For instance, the sort of ideas of tendencies versus violent tendencies within women. I think they exact. I do see that there are elements of that make sense. Labeling it toxic is productive. I think labeling it toxic is productive. I think that speaks to a larger bias, the very nature that we've labeled it as toxic. We could call it plenty, but generally itself is a really serious problem for me as well. So that should probably be it's a problem for a lot of other people as well. So it just gives the wrong impression. It sends a message.
Okay, so that's where I'm going to end that. It's frustrating because we didn't get to finish the actual part of the conversation we were at the very least. I don't know that we would have ever come to an agreement, but that's not really relevant. It's still frustrating when technical glitches are what ends a conversation. I don't think I'm going to say much here. I was going to take a look at some of the constructive criticism I got from my fellow lefties, but there's a lot of citation in there. I need to take some time and read through a lot of the studies and the research that I wasn't even aware existed. Like I knew there was lots of information about the topics that feminism discusses, and I always found it to be relatively evidence-based, but I had no idea just how much evidence there was in favor of some of this stuff. So I can't really speak to that in terms of this conversation with Gray until I've read that research. Other than that, I just want to really thank everybody who, I guess I really want to first thank Gray for talking to me and for posting this on his YouTube channel. He's got a way bigger following than I do. I'm not sure that I'll draw any of his people into my kind of podcast community, but if they do and they're interested in learning some stuff about feminism, maybe we can learn some stuff together. I also want to thank the people in the groups, Donna and HJ and Dave, specifically for the things they said, for the criticism and the kind words. It's nice to have a community where you can get supportive criticism and you can learn what to do better, and it is nice to see that and learn more things. Like I'm all about the learning. Okay, so that said, I think that's about it. I'm going to say you can check out the show notes, not that there will be many for this, at thebrainstormpodcast.com and our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Destin Sucks, Lachlan, Lisa, Magnus, Michael, Nathan, Positively Skeptical, Rob, Stephanie, and the Utah Outcasts. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. You can normally join us live every second week when we broadcast live on brainstormradio.net. Our next episode might not be available live. I'll keep it posted on the Facebook page, so watch for that. Our next guests are Keith and Jen from the Not Another Atheist podcast, another great atheist Canadian podcast. I want to thank Gray for chatting with me. You can find his stuff on YouTube by searching Morally Gray, but I will also post a link in the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com. The notes on brainstormblog.net are, as usual, a work in progress. Still accepting applications for helpers. I will pay people. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing the voiceover for the intro and some of our ads. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music, which I'm not going to add in this time. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.